Welcome to the programme. Well, for the next hour, we are joined by the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, Navi Pillay. She's going to be here to answer your questions. From Guantanamo Bay to the use of chemical weapons in Syria, drone attacks in Pakistan to women's rights in India. We're going to be joined by guests in Iran, in India and in China. But wherever you are around the world, of course, you can get in touch across social media. If you've got a question, you can use the hashtag #askpillay, or you can get in touch in the usual ways.
People are going to want to know. Let's just say something.
Well, thank you for being with us here on World Have Your Say. Of course, throughout the conversation for the next hour, all of your comments will be coming to me here on my tablet. So I'll obviously try and get those involved in the conversation. But first of all, I'd like to say welcome very much to Navi Pillay, the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights. We've got many questions coming into us, as you can imagine. I want to start by bringing this comment to you. Earlier, we spoke to Ahmed in Damascus. He was detained by the government for 45 days, despite not having committed a crime. Now, he said, I was tortured, I was denied access to a toilet and access to medical help. People died every day in the detention centre. Where is the UN to help people like us in Syria? Navi Pillay, how do you respond to that?
Well, firstly, thank you very much, Chloe. I'm very pleased to be on World Have Your Say. And it's so important that Ahmed raises this question because, like him, there are thousands of Syrians held in detention under terrible conditions, subject to ill treatment. And we are denied access to these people, including the International Red Cross and Red Crescent. So he finds himself in a situation where there is almost total breakdown of law. It's the authorities who have a responsibility to protect Ahmed and all other Syrians who are partly involved in violating their rights. So there's no rule of law and no immediate protection for him. But I would like to assure Ahmed that the world is watching. My office, the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, the Syrian Commission of Inquiry, the Security Council, the General Assembly are all extremely concerned. We can't intervene directly now because we don't have access, but we are deeply concerned about what has happened to him and what is continuing to happen to people who are held in detention. They include women and children as well.
You say that you're deeply concerned, the UN is deeply concerned, you say the world is watching, but Charles in Trinidad has posted on our Facebook page and he says, what is the UN actually doing about large-scale human rights violations which are being carried out by Syria, predominantly by the Assad regime? What are you actually doing?
Well, firstly, we have a UN international framework created by all the governments of the world. And they create legal obligations for states. In this particular situation, you have a failure of the system because one state, one government is defying these obligations. It's when all the states cooperate and observe human rights, the standards that they set, that we can best protect human rights. I would say in this particular case, the UN feels helpless. The Secretary General is urging a political solution to get people to talk. I have consistently called for a referral to the International Criminal Court because I believe serious crimes have been committed there, both on the side of the Assad government and the opposition forces. And I also support these talks. We are calling for humanitarian corridors so that we could reach the people inside.
You talk about those concerns about abuses being carried out by both sides in Syria. Susie, who lives in Damascus, has posted at facebook.com/World Have Your Say. She says, I'd like to know what Mr. Pillay's opinion is about Abu Saka, who was a Syrian soldier who was killed. His internal organs were cut out and eaten by rebels. What can you say to the dead soldier's mother as you are supporting these killers?
All right. Firstly, I and nor does the United Nations support these killers. We condemn the acts committed by these opposition forces, one of whom was captured on video wrenching the organ out of a dead soldier. And I have issued a public statement condemning that, once again, saying this is a kind of act that amounts to a war crime and should be investigated by the International Criminal Court.
Well, I'm pleased to say that Navi Pillay is going to be with us for the whole hour. If you've got any questions for her, you can use the hashtag askpillay or, as always, the hashtag WHYS. Let's cross now to the world's newsroom and we can speak to Hazem Al-Kholi, who is from BBC Arabic. Hazem, give us a sense of what your listeners, your writers, your viewers are telling you in relation to abuses in Syria and the sort of things they want to hear from Navi Pillay.
For Navi Pillay, the most repeated questions are about Syria and the standards that UN work on human rights. So on the Syria, we have a question from Muhammad Al-Khawaja. He's saying what the UN is going to do about what he described as the crimes committed in Syria against civilians, children, women, and the crimes that already authenticated by different human groups. Another question that was repeated very much on our Facebook page is the standards. Some people say that the UN have a double standard in dealing with human rights issue. We have here Amin Hassan is giving an example of what's going in Burma and the killing of the Muslims there, and he's saying that the UN didn't do anything about it. And we have Faisal Ahmad, who asked about the UN dealing with the rights of the Palestinian workers who work inside Israel and in the settlements.
Many issues you raised there. I don't know if Navi Pillay, you want to immediately look at this idea of double standards that was raised there several times by my colleague at BBC Arabic.
Yes, certainly. Let me say firstly how important these questions are, because these are factors that trouble us. When we speak of the United Nations, remember that it's an organization of member states, of governments. The highest body is the Security Council, and presently this is where all our disappointment is targeted. 5 of those member states have a veto power, and many of the decisions, instead of placing human beings at the center and human rights protection, and instead of intervening immediately, they could have intervened in Syria 2 years ago when I addressed the Security Council and said what's happening now are innocent protesters demanding their legitimate human rights. At that point, 1,000 persons had been killed by the authorities. And I pleaded for intervention by this body, which is a political body. So when viewers and questioners are speaking about double standards, this is what they're looking at, that states are not placing human rights as the standards. They're placing their own interests as their standards. So I am highly critical of that too. The first question related to, obviously, that's our concern. What is going to be done for victims who have suffered? And my call always is, firstly, these are crimes. They must be investigated because victims need justice. Secondly, they need reparation, and they want to know what happened to their loved ones who had been killed or who have disappeared. Immediately, they need humanitarian assistance, and we have pleaded, the Secretary General, Valerie Amos of Humanitarian Affairs, High Commissioner for Refugees, Guterres, has pleaded for assistance from all states so that people who were forced to flee Syria and who are now undergoing huge hardships can have food, shelter, and tented accommodation. So this is what the UN is doing at the one hand, but please distinguish between the UN and those who are in charge of the political decision-making in the United Nations. With regard to the Muslims in Myanmar, I have issued statements about this. We have human rights advisors on the ground in Myanmar reporting on the serious violations of Muslims and called upon the government to immediately look into the root causes of this ethnic conflict. The government has told me that it's not an ethnic conflict, it's not a religious conflict. It's to do with a struggle for economic resources. But in all the facts to me point to ethnic conflict, and it's been spurred by rather inflammatory statements made by the authorities. So please assure our Facebook questioner that when it comes to the Muslims, when it comes to Rohingyas, we are monitoring the situation and demanding that their human rights be respected, that they be protected.
Navi Pillay, I have to say, first of all, thank you so much for remembering all of those questions which we put to you in one go, and we'll put them one by one. Many of you getting in touch with us from all around the world: Pakistan, Bangladesh, India, Kenya, Canada. Keep your questions coming to us on the hashtag WHYS. Let's bring in someone who now has a question. Arthi is a fashion designer in Mumbai, joins us on the line now. What question do you have for Navi Pillay?
Hi, I'm Arthi, and I would like to talk today about women's rights and safety in India as an issue. And if you're aware, in December there was a brutal gang rape of a young girl on board a bus in Delhi, and it created a huge outcry by citizens all over the country, men and women alike. But despite our concerns, despite raising our voices and protests, rapes continue around the country every day for women, old, young, and even minors. So my question to you, Commissioner, is what would be the UN's role in, helping the situation and making India safer for women?
Let me say that India, like every one of the other 193 countries in the world, has its human rights situation reviewed by other states in the Human Rights Council. It's called the Universal Periodic Review, and recommendations are made to India to address the very situation you describe, which obviously has been there for decades unaddressed, women and children unprotected, until there was an explosion of media attention and civil society protests after the bus rape, which of course I'm also following, was followed by a series of other rapes. The Special Rapporteur on Violence Against Women recently visited India, and she would have preferred to have gone around freely and spoken to countries. I myself contributed to the Verma Commission report, which has a very comprehensive set of actions that the government could take immediately to protect women against these kind of violence. Let me say, India has very good laws, but there's no point in having good laws on paper if it's not implemented. So bottom line, that's a problem, and that's a message the UN is sending to India. Implement your laws, train your police force to protect people rather than to add to their problems.
And that is Navi Pillay, who is the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights. She's with us for the next 45 minutes or so. So if you've got any questions, do get in touch. All of the contact details on the screen throughout the programme. We're going to be getting more comments and questions from Pakistan and Guinea. We'll take a quick break and then we'll carry on talking.
No, I talking about it. Let me say something. No, I talking about it. Let me say something.
Welcome back to World Have Your Say. I'm pleased to say that we have the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, Navi Pillay, with us for the remainder of the programme. So many of you getting in touch with us. We've got people getting in touch from Sweden, Mauritius, Somalia, Gambia, Sudan. Do keep those questions coming. Let's go straight now to a video. We got this from Mariam in Pakistan.
My name is Mariam Kizilbash, and I work for an organization called Foundation for Fundamental Rights in Islamabad, which represents civilian victims of US drone strikes in Pakistan. My question to you, UN High Commissioner, is what near action can we expect from the United Nations in face of these drone strikes, which are eroding 100 years of carefully established international law?
I'm really sorry for Pakistan, which is the a place where there's been the largest number of civilian deaths as a result of drone strikes. But drones have been used in other places as well, such as Afghanistan, Yemen, and Somalia. I have raised concerns about drone strikes and their use, and have called for transparency and regulation. We need to know what criteria are used when they target individuals. So really, this is an area where UN regulations have not been brought up to date. We need to understand in what circumstances they can be used, and whether the laws of war that we currently have in respect of other weapons can cover this situation. For instance, there should not be indiscriminate killings. Civilians at all times should be protected from these attacks. I'm concerned that more and more states are now applying to use drone technology. So if this is going to be on the increase, there's an urgent need then for it to be properly regulated.
Well, Navi Pillay, as you can imagine, lots of people getting in touch about drone strikes and indeed the idea of certain countries around the world being untouchable. Here are a couple of comments that have come into us. Oluwatosin in San Francisco posted on Facebook, "What about drone strikes? Don't they constitute arbitrary extrajudicial assassinations? If Iran, Russia or China were doing this, you would have been all over it." And also we've got Ahmed in Guinea, who's posted at facebook.com/World Have Your Say. Is the US above the Human Rights Commission, or is Africa the only place where human rights are abused? Navi Pillay, do you want to respond to those?
There isn't a country in the world that can claim to be free of human rights violations, and I cover the globe. My mandate says protect human rights of all over the world. With regard to drone strikes, there have been very pertinent discussions on this subject before the Human Rights Council as a result of reports filed by the special rapporteurs, and they have documented the use of drones, particularly by the United States. The main problem is the lack of transparency and the lack of knowing what criteria they use when they use drones, against whom and why. And this is what we're calling for, greater transparency. We're not saying that it is illegal, but we're saying it has to be more clearly spelled out under international law. The way it affects victims is that they are extremely vulnerable and could be targeted. They don't know why they're going to be targeted for assassination. I issued a public statement condemning the assassination contract that President Obama issued against the individual in Yemen, for instance. No country is above the law, and the United States in particular, as it claims to hold the moral leadership in the world to tell other governments what to do, has to itself subject itself to scrutiny and be transparent about the weapons it uses. And I do welcome that President Obama, in a recent announcement, seemed to suggest that he will be more transparent. He will call for greater transparency. Well, this is a little shift, and I would welcome that.
Well, as you can imagine, we're getting lots of questions coming in to the BBC that aren't just in English. Let's go to the World's Newsroom now and speak to my colleague Sana Safi from the BBC Afghan service. Tell us what question you've got.
Well, we have had huge interest in this subject. It's one of the most heated and debatable issues that people put forward. And the question that we have got are the killing of civilians in Afghanistan when NATO and international forces operation go wrong. Hakim Khan Samsour says, what has the UN done seriously to condemn NATO's raids which have killed women, children and the old in Afghanistan?
The UN has Yeah, the UN, the question relates to Afghanistan, the raids that result in massive killings, and even today, we, together with the office, our joint office in Afghanistan, together with the UN mission, has released a report precisely documenting violations, conditions in detention. The United Nations condemns these acts, holds not only government sources but non-state actors responsible for this. We are there helping to investigate and urging prosecution, but mainly protection of civilians. Whoever is the problem, whether it's non-state actors or the government, it's civilians who are caught in the middle. It's extremely important that the government, whose primary responsibility it is to protect civilians, that set up the structures instead of waiting for these events to happen. They are going on and on, including suicide bombings and so on.
Well, as we speak, so many people from all around the world are getting in touch with us to ask their questions. Ali is a Syrian in Turkey. He's just picked up the phone and called us here on World Have Your Say. His question is, what is the UN doing for asylum seekers from Syria?
The UN is immediately attending to the absolute urgent needs of almost 1 billion displaced people. Amongst them clearly are asylum seekers who have every good reason to fear for their lives, or who had been subject to torture and ill treatment, or their families have. So I fully agree that there are very many asylum seekers in this group, and the United Nations, mainly led by the High Commissioner for Refugees, has his team on the ground in all the neighboring states of Syria, very carefully taking down the statements and the requests of asylum seekers. The United Nations is appealing to not only neighboring states but other states to provide asylum for these asylum seekers.
We don't have much time left on this part of the programme, but one quick question. Anthony has posted on Facebook, what are you doing about human rights issues in Egypt?
Egypt inspired all of us after the demonstrations, where not only through social media but men, women and children participated. Their freedom and their liberation, their thirst for fundamental human rights was so important that we were immediately offered our assistance. What I'm doing now is watching the laws that are being drafted, including the laws on NGOs, the laws on affecting women.
We need to take a quick break, but what we're going to do is we will carry on talking. Keep all of your comments coming. See you in a couple of minutes.
Let me say something.
Hello, I'm Chloe Tilley. Welcome back to World Have Your Say. For the next 20 minutes or so, we are joined by the UN's Commissioner for Human Rights, Navi Pillay. If you have any questions for her, you can use the hashtag askpillay.
Talking about it.
Top priority.
I experience.
Is this what?
This is chaos.
People are going to want to know.
Let me say something.
And just before the break, I very rudely interrupted Navi Pillay, who was talking to us about human rights issues in Egypt. And I have to say, before we go any further, I do apologise for that. But do you want to finish the answer that you were giving us about human rights in Egypt?
Yes, not at all. Actually, that's a very important question. I have written to President Morsi expressing concerns about their draft NGO law, which is restrictive, not in compliance with all the international treaties that Egypt has signed. I've also written about their laws that point towards restricting women's rights instead of preserving and cherishing equality. These are obviously the fundamental traits of democracy that the population fought for. And I want to say that I made those statements public because I want attention at the drafting stage to those provisions.
Well, one issue we are now going to talk about, many people have been getting in touch with us about, is Guantanamo Bay, something that I know Navi Pillay has been talking about a lot over the recent months and years. Let's bring in Aisha now from the London Guantanamo campaign. Aisha, thank you for joining us on World Have Your Say. What's your question for Navi Pillay?
Well, we're told that the men who are held at Guantanamo Bay are terrorists, and that's largely the reason for why they're held there without charge or trial for almost 12 years. What we've seen over the last 12 years across the world through Guantanamo and extraordinary rendition is the creation of a system of arbitrary detention and indefinite detention, and it's based on arbitrary definition of what terrorism is, and it leads to arbitrary punishments for various people across the world, not just in Guantanamo, but also, as we've seen in Abu Ghraib in Afghanistan, and the system's being exported to softer options in other countries. And so what we have is working on this very, very flimsy definition of terrorism, which then leads to so much wrongdoing and so much impunity and lack of accountability for governments. My question is, why hasn't the United Nations done anything to define terrorism, which apparently is the greatest threat we face in the world today and is the basis for holding these men at Guantanamo Bay and thousands of, if not tens and hundreds of thousands of people in similar situations around the world?
Aisha, let me say up front, I absolutely agree with you. The Guantanamo represents a violation of all that we respect under rule of law. It represents a violation of international law, which speaks of fair trial, no detention without a charge, and if you have no evidence against a person, you're supposed to release the person and not hold them, as you say, for years. And I've come out publicly asking President Obama to shut down Guantanamo, to stop the force feeding, and provide some hope to detainees who have taken the ultimate step of starving themselves to death because they have no other hope, no release, no charge. The United Nations is very, very clear. The United Nations, on the one hand, condemns terrorism. On the other hand, it has very clear provisions on counter-terrorism measures. They must comply with international law. They must comply with the rule of law. No one can just take the law into their hands. And this is why I even condemned the killing of Osama bin Laden and called for transparency there as well.
Mm-hmm. But we're working without a clear and set definition of what terrorism actually is. So on that basis, the United States can call the men in Guantanamo Bay terrorists, even though they haven't been charged or tried. And as you said as well, somebody like Osama bin Laden, but also thousands of innocent, or potentially innocent people around the world who are also held in arbitrary, indefinite detention, sometimes just simply because they happen to be dissidents or they happen to express views or discriminatory issues such as being of an ethnic group or a religious group or a political group that's not liked by a particular government. So we're working with something that's very arbitrary. So how can we really have clear-cut and legal counter-terrorism rules if we don't have a definition of what terrorism is in the first place? And potentially that should protect both the victims of terrorism, as in the victims who end up being punished for things that they haven't actually done, as well as people who are victims of the criminal effects of terrorism, and also against countries using this as an excuse to act arbitrarily in their own interests. And you've mentioned that states do put their own interests above human rights already.
Mm-hmm. I agree with you. The lack of a clear definition of terrorism means that it's open to abuse, all kinds of activities, depending on the way a state authority sees the situation or a law enforcement official sees the situation, then comes under this wide net of terrorism. I think at the time the UK was drafting its own laws on terrorism, this is exactly what I raised, that your definition is overbroad and has too wide a reach. You have to be very clear in law, and this is what courts do. They look for precision in the law. I do take your point, and I'm going to go and personally examine again how the United Nations has defined terrorism and compare that with national legal systems as well.
Thank you.
Aisha from
I
the
also
London
think-
Guantanamo campaign, I want to say thank you very much for joining us. We're getting so many questions in here to us at World Have Your Say. I want to try and get through as many of them as we possibly can. Let's go back now to Sana Safi from the BBC Afghan service. When we talk about Guantanamo, is that reflective of the kind of comments that you're receiving?
Oh, this is something that many people have touched on in their comments on our Facebook page and Twitter, and the emails that we have been receiving, not just in Afghanistan or our Afghan listeners, but from people who are living across the Duran line, from Pashtuns across the line over in Pakistan. Lalmir Mangal here has written to us. He is saying that there are a lot of innocent people in Guantanamo and Bagram right now who have been there for years. Have you done anything to help them? And this is not just what I mean, this is something that many people have touched on, many people have discussed it over and over again.
Let's pull up another question that has come into us. Someone has tweeted using the, they're tweeting his term insane, asked the question, it's using the hashtag askpillay. Will the UN help people like Bradley Manning and Edward Snowden find a place on earth where they can live in peace?
Well, the first question first then. Through the Human Rights Council, the special procedures, we have condemned the huge incidents of torture in Bagram, called for the closure of Bagram, and for the release of detainees there, both in Bagram and Guantanamo. I have also gone out to many other states appealing for them to help resettle the detainees, because if the problem is that no country is willing to receive them because of the so-called terrorist tag that now attaches to them quite unfairly, after all, they've never been tried or convicted. So a consistent call for their release, a consistent indication and monitoring of their conditions of treatment, both torture and the force feeding. And I will be consistent in calling for the closure of these unlawful, illegal detention centers. Now, with regard to the question relating to the Snowden and others, the United Nations has very clear policies on asylum. People can apply for asylum and set out the criteria of the threats they face. So without touching on these individual cases, I can't guarantee that the UN will provide them with alternate accommodation, but asylum provisions are very clear. The High Commissioner for Refugees has settled numerous asylum seekers, both individuals and groups. We will continue to do that. I have obviously looked at this matter from the point of view of surveillance and the invasion of the privacy rights of individuals.
Well, let's cross from issues in the US and cross now to Nepal. We've got another video for you sent to us from Tempa, a Tibetan refugee who's in Nepal.
My name is Tempa Gume. I'm a Tibetan refugee living in Nepal. My question is, even after 119 self-emulations, nothing has changed in Tibet. When we see the UN's inability and reluctance when dealing with Chinese government, we are left with this sick feeling of helplessness and disgust. Will UN ever do anything against strong nations like China for their human rights record? Why is there this inability and reluctance?
This is a theme that we've had so many comments on this. Do forgive me, Navi Pillay. We've had so many comments on this about the idea of taking on strong nations, whether it's the US or indeed China, as in this case.
Well, let me assure you that the Human Rights Council looks at the human rights record of China as it does with every other country. And China will come up for review in October this year. And the same criteria will be applied to China. So both powerful or weak countries, good or bad countries, are all treated to scrutiny. The issue you raise of Tibetans in China is an area that really concerns me. I have issued public statements asking China not to treat this as a security matter, but to look into the root causes of the suffering of Tibetans and why they are seem to be driven to such extreme measures of protest, such as self-immolation. I've also called on Tibetan leaders to discourage this practice and to express their protests and differences without the sacrifice of lives as they are doing.
Well, you talk about those self-immolations. We've had this comment come in from Kundan in Nepal, more than 120 in Tibet. Why is the UN silent? Are Tibetans not human beings?
Tibetans are very much human beings. The world cares about them. Firstly, we begin by saying, please don't go to such extreme measures where you have to kill yourself. We are urging China to address the situation, and I'm hoping that there may be little signs of hope. They have invited me to come to China, and when I go, I will definitely go to the Tibetan territory to see for myself. But otherwise, this is a situation, again, that requires a political solution. My concern is the human rights of the people of Tibet in the meantime, and that their suffering has to be examined by China and addressed.
Well, Navi Pillay, we've got a guest who's been waiting incredibly patiently to ask a question to you. We can cross now to Iran and speak to Madi. Thank you so much for your patience. What's your question?
Hello, High Commissioner. Madi from Iran. I have a question regarding the effects of your office on Islamic countries. Non-secular states, and most importantly Islamic countries, have adopted a human rights declaration which doesn't really address basic human rights which are recognized by its Universal Declaration. As a person living in Iran whose basic rights such as freedom of speech and freedom of religion is not fully recognized, what does UN Human Rights Division does for people like me so we can enjoy these freedoms? Is this part of your efforts? Do you try to oblige our government to respect human rights? Thank you.
Well, that question didn't come very clearly to me, but obviously I get the gist of it.
Let me explain it to you. Basically, yes. He was asking, at what point do you get involved in a country like Iran where the citizens' human rights are not being respected?
We have always been concerned about the human rights of citizens in Iran, particularly human rights defenders, journalists, opposition and critics of the government who are being detained and held on spurious charges or sentenced to long-term imprisonments. Also that the death penalty is used without a fair and proper trial process. I also have been invited to come to Iran. I intend to go there just to raise these particular matters. I constantly write to the government. I see recently there's been a very small shift, a release of a prisoner or two, and I'm hoping that the administration of President Rouhani will provide perhaps a fresh opportunity for engagement to bring a relaxation of these very heavy restrictions on the political opposition, on the media and civil society. The United Nations has appointed as a country rapporteur just to report on the situation in Iran, but Iran has not allowed that rapporteur inside the country. Nevertheless, he has gathered enough factual information on the human rights violations there, and he's reported them before the Human Rights Council, where the response was urging Iran to comply with their human rights obligations to protect their citizens.
Well, as I look down now on my tablet computer, I can see that just in the last few minutes, people have been getting in touch from around 30 countries. Thank you so much. Qatar, Turkey, UK, Ghana, Malaysia, Nepal, the list goes on. Thank you so much. You can use the hashtag #AskPillay for the next few minutes. We're going to take a quick break and then we'll carry on talking.
No, I actually talking about it. Let me say something. No, I actually talking about it. Let me say something.
Hello, welcome back to World Have Your Say. I'm Chloe Tilley. So many questions coming in for the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, Navi Pillay. Let's go straight now to Davis Makiyala, who is former director of Changing Attitudes in Nigeria. Davis, thank you for joining us. What's your question?
Nigeria is a signatory to the international treaties supporting non-discrimination based on identity, dignity, equality of all persons. What is the UN doing to ensure that all states are keeping and respecting these treaties that they ratified or signed?
You are quite right. Nigeria has signed many treaties. And Nigeria has to report how it's implementing and delivering on its obligations. There are 10 treaty bodies now. They all, in various ways, require Nigeria to come before it and respond as to how it's addressing discrimination in various forms, including the ones you detailed. And these are public forums, and civil society are present. So if you have any direct complaints, do send them to us and we will refer them to the treaty bodies where Nigeria presents its report.
Well, recently there is this major one that is going through the Parliament of Nigeria. Both the Senate and the House of Representatives just passed a same-sex marriage prohibition bill, which have about 14 years prison sentence for same-sex people, or also for their family members or anyone who associate, or even those who offer services to same-sex people in the language of this bill. And this bill has gone through Parliament and is waiting for the President to sign it into law.
The programme left, and I do want to get Navi Pillay's brief response to that, because we've got one other question we want to get in.
I am very concerned that the rights of LGBT people, that's the sexual orientation right, are being violated, that they are subject to discrimination. And I condemn this law of Nigeria because it violates the equality clause both in Nigerian law as well as the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which speaks of equality for all.
Thank you so much for that brief answer. Let's go straight now to my colleague at the World's Newsroom, Mani Vannan, who lots of questions coming in about Sri Lanka. Mani Vannan, tell us what question you have.
We have a number of questions from the BBC Tamil Service listeners online and on Facebook and Twitter. Most of the questions relate to the lack of progress towards accountability and reconciliation in Sri Lanka, with listeners asking, in spite of the fact that 4 years have gone by since the end of the war, we haven't had any serious or significant progress towards reconciliation in Sri Lanka.
So and you're saying, forgive me for jumping in, they want progress. What progress is going to come? Briefly, if you would, Navi Pillay.
Well, Sri Lanka has invited me, and I'm going on a formal visit there in August. And this is what I want to see for myself. I have called for an international investigation to investigate the root causes of the conflict, to investigate what happened during the last days of the war, and to ensure that the rights of victims to the truth, the right of victims for reparation is ensured. And I hope to be able to speak to as many people as possible on my visit to Sri Lanka.
Navi Pillay, thank you so much for all of your time on World Have Your Say today. I'm sorry we didn't get through all of your questions, but it's been great for you getting involved. We'll speak to you again soon. Thanks for watching.